Hey coin lovers! Welcome to the Worth Old Coins channel, your place to discover the hidden value and rare facts about old coins. In today's video we're revealing the top 8 valuable coins, and one of them might just be in your collection. So don't skip this video, let's find out their real worth. Top 1. The halfpenny coin of 1962 featuring Queen Elizabeth II is part of the long history of British pre-decimal coinage, and while at first glance it may appear to be just a small copper coin of minimal face value, its story unfolds into a rich narrative of tradition, empire, economy, and numismatic legacy. The halfpenny was once a very practical unit of currency in Britain, circulating as part of the pounds, shillings, pence system, where 240 pence made 1 pound sterling. Within this system, the halfpenny played the role of a small but important denomination, allowing prices to be divided with great precision in an era long before decimalization simplified the monetary system. The 1962 issue belongs firmly to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, who had ascended to the throne in 1952 following the death of her father, King George V. By 1962, the Queen had already celebrated her first decade as monarch, and her youthful portrait on the halfpenny captured her in her early reign, symbolizing stability and continuity at a time when Britain was undergoing dramatic social and cultural transformation. The obverse design of the 1962 halfpenny coin bears the first definitive portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, designed by sculptor Mary Gillick. This was the original effigy used on coins from the beginning of her reign until 1968. Gillick's portrait is notable for its youthful and idealized presentation of the Queen. Unlike the later portraits, which gradually aged her appearance to reflect the passage of time, Gillick's effigy shows Elizabeth II wearing a laurel wreath, a classical symbol of victory, honor, and peace. Her hair is styled neatly tied with ribbons, and her face is depicted in a serene and dignified profile. Around the edge of the obverse is the Latin legend, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. Laughing Face, which expands to, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. This inscription reflects both her secular and spiritual role, affirming her authority as monarch and her title as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The elegance of Gillick's portrait and the timelessness of the inscription created an impression of youthful monarchy combined with centuries of tradition, which helped the nation transition into the modern Elizabethan era. Turning to the reverse design, one finds a motif that speaks to Britain's maritime heritage: the image of Sir Francis Drake's galleon, the Golden Hind. This design was created by Thomas Humphrey Paget, T.H. Paget, a talented designer who contributed extensively to British coinage during the mid-20th century. The Golden Hind was the ship that Drake used to circumnavigate the globe between 1577 and 1580, an extraordinary feat of exploration and seamanship that elevated England's status as a rising naval power. By featuring the Golden Hind on the reverse of the halfpenny, Britain celebrated its proud naval past, its history of exploration, and its role in building global connections. The ship is shown in full sail, with its rigging, masts, and hull beautifully detailed, giving the design both a sense of motion and historical accuracy. Above the ship, the denomination halfpenny is inscribed, while at the bottom is the year of issue, 1962. This reverse design had been introduced in 1937 under George VI, and it remained unchanged throughout Elizabeth II's pre-decimal halfpennies until the denomination was discontinued in 1967. The technical specifications of the 1962 halfpenny coin are equally important in understanding its place in history. The coin was struck in bronze, an alloy consisting primarily of copper with small amounts of tin and zinc. This gave the coin its rich reddish-brown appearance, which could darken to a deep chocolate hue over time with circulation and oxidation. The coin has a diameter of 25.48 millimeters, a weight of 5.67 grams, and a plain edge. These specifications had been standard for the halfpenny since the 1930s and ensured that the coin was easily distinguishable by size and weight among other denominations in circulation. The coin was relatively large for such a low value, which is one reason why it was eventually phased out. Its production and handling were disproportionate to its purchasing power. From a historical perspective, the year 1962 was a fascinating time in Britain. The country was emerging from the hardships of post-war recovery, and the 1960s were beginning to define themselves as a period of cultural revolution, technological innovation, and political change. While the halfpenny remained a small coin, it was still relevant in everyday life as prices in the early 1960s were low enough to justify its use. For example, sweets, newspapers, and small household items often cost in the range of a few pennies, and shopkeepers relied on the halfpenny to make exact change. The coin thus became a familiar companion in daily transactions carried in the purses and pockets of millions of Britons. However, inflation and economic modernization were gradually eroding the coin's practicality. By the mid-1960s, its usefulness was diminishing, and the government began to prepare for decimalization, which would be implemented in 1971. As such, the 1962 issue sits in the later years of the halfpenny's existence, representing both continuity with the Victorian and Edwardian coinage tradition and the looming changes of the modern monetary system. When we explore the symbolism of the Golden Hind, it becomes clear why this design resonated so strongly with the British public. Sir Francis Drake, though controversial in his time for his privateering activities, became a national hero for his daring circumnavigation and his role in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. The Golden Hind represented England's emergence as a naval power capable of projecting influence across the seas. To place such a symbol on a humble halfpenny coin was to remind every citizen of the island nation's seafaring past and its global legacy. In this sense, the coin was not just a tool of commerce but also a miniature historical monument, carrying patriotic meaning in every transaction. This connection between coinage and national identity is a hallmark of British numismatic tradition. From a numismatic standpoint, the 1962 halfpenny is of interest to collectors for several reasons. Firstly, it belongs to the first portrait series of Elizabeth II, which is always historically significant, as it represents the beginning of her record-breaking reign. Secondly, coins of the early 1960s are widely available but still valued when found in uncirculated condition. Circulated examples of the 1962 halfpenny generally hold only modest value, often around face value or a small premium, but uncirculated or proof-like specimens can be more desirable. Collectors often pursue complete date runs of the Elizabeth II halfpennies, making the 1962 issue an essential piece in any set. Since millions of these coins were struck, rarity is not the key factor, but condition is. Coins preserved without wear, retaining their original mint luster and detail, are sought after, while those heavily circulated serve more as nostalgic relics of a bygone era. Top 2. The 1967 halfpenny coin of Queen Elizabeth II is one of the most symbolic pre-decimal coins in British numismatic history. At first glance, it may appear as just another small bronze coin with a galleon on its reverse and the Queen's portrait on the obverse. Yet when studied in its full historical, economic, and cultural context, the 1967 issue emerges as a marker of transition, the end of one of the oldest denominations in English coinage. The halfpenny had been part of the British currency system for centuries, dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period. For much of its history, it was essential for daily transactions, allowing precise accounting in the complex pound-SD, pounds, shillings, pence system where 12 pennies equaled 1 shilling and 20 shillings equaled 1 pound. The halfpenny was worth 1/480th of a pound sterling. By 1967, however, the economic role of the coin was diminishing. Inflation had eroded its purchasing power, and the public was preparing for decimalization in 1971. The 1967 issue, therefore, represents not just a coin, but the very end of an era in British money. The obverse of the coin features the youthful first portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by sculptor Mary Gillick, a design used on all circulating British coins from 1953 until the late 1960s. This effigy, still admired for its elegance and classic style, shows the Queen wearing a laurel wreath tied with ribbons harking back to ancient Roman tradition where the laurel crown symbolized victory, dignity, and honor. Unlike later portraits of Elizabeth II, which reflected her aging features and a more formal bearing, the Gillick portrait was deliberately youthful and idealistic. It captured the spirit of the early years of her reign, following her coronation in 1953, when she was still in her 20s. Around the effigy runs the Latin inscription, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. Laughing Face. This expands to Elizabeth II, by the grace of God Queen, defender of the faith, combining her constitutional authority with her role as head of the Church of England. The legend and portrait together symbolized continuity of monarchy, reverence for tradition, and the optimism of a new Elizabethan age. On the reverse side, the coin displays one of the most enduring and beloved designs of British coinage, the depiction of the Golden Hind, Sir Francis Drake's famous galleon, by designer Thomas Humphrey Paget, T.H. Paget. The Golden Hind holds a prominent place in England's history. T was the ship in which Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, an expedition that established him as a national hero and projected England's naval prowess onto the global stage. By placing the Golden Hind on the halfpenny, Britain celebrated its maritime tradition, its age of exploration, and its heritage as a seafaring power. The ship is shown in full sail, carefully detailed with masts, rigging, and billowing sails. Above the ship, the denomination halfpenny is boldly inscribed, while at the bottom appears the year of issue, 1967. This design had been introduced under King George VI in 1937 and continued unchanged into the Elizabethan series, making it a familiar and much-loved motif for 3 decades. From a technical perspective, the 1967 halfpenny was struck in bronze, a copper-based alloy, giving it a warm reddish-brown color that would darken with age and circulation. The coin had a diameter of 25.48 millimeters, a weight of 5.67 grams, and a thickness of about 1.5 millimeters. Its edge was plain, with no reading or lettering. These specifications had been fixed since the recoinage of 1860, when bronze replaced copper in the penny, halfpenny, and farthing series. By modern standards, the halfpenny was quite a large coin for such a low denomination, nearly the size of the later decimal 2-pence coin. This disproportion contributed to its eventual discontinuation, as the cost of production and the inconvenience of handling outweighed its usefulness in circulation. Historically, 1967 was the last year the halfpenny was minted for circulation, even though decimalization would not occur until 1971. This is why the 1967 issue is often referred to as the farewell halfpenny. No halfpennies dated 1968, 1969, or 1970 exist for general circulation. The denomination was quietly withdrawn as Britain prepared for its new decimal system. Interestingly, the Royal Mint struck a massive number of 1,967 halfpennies, tens of millions, to ensure adequate supply before decimalization, since the denomination was still needed in shops. As a result, the 1967 issue is one of the most common pre-decimal coins surviving today, often found in old tins, drawers, and inherited collections across Britain. For many people, the 1967 halfpenny was one of the last coins they handled in the old pound-SD system, making it a nostalgic piece of living history. The economic role of the halfpenny by 1967 was already marginal. While in earlier decades the coin could purchase small items like sweets, newspapers, or bus fares, by the mid-1960s inflation had rendered it increasingly impractical. Shopkeepers used them mostly for exact pricing, but many members of the public considered them more of a nuisance than a necessity. Still, in a system based on 12 pence to the shilling, the halfpenny retained some mathematical usefulness, especially for dividing sums and calculating prices. It was only with the planned switch to decimal currency, where 100 new pence would equal £1, that the halfpenny became officially redundant. In fact, even in the decimal system, Britain issued a decimal halfpenny from 1971 until 1984, but that coin was much smaller and shorter-lived than its pre-decimal ancestor. Culturally, the golden hind reverse of the halfpenny had come to represent Britain's maritime glory to an entire generation. School children who handled the coin were indirectly reminded of Sir Francis Drake and his voyages. The galleon design, seen millions of times in daily transactions, functioned almost as a miniature history lesson. In this way, the 1967 halfpenny tied together the economic, educational, and cultural strands of British life. It was not just a coin, but a piece of national identity, linking Elizabethan seafaring exploits of the 16th century with the Elizabethan monarchy of the 20th. From a numismatic perspective, the 1967 halfpenny is very common, since it was struck in large numbers and widely saved after decimalization. In circulated condition, its value is typically little more than face value, but in uncirculated or proof-like states, collectors prize it for its luster and sharp detail. The coin also has sentimental value as it represents the very end of the circulating halfpenny series, which had lasted for centuries. Collectors often seek the 1967 issue as a type coin for the Elizabeth II halfpenny, since it is so easily obtainable and carries historical finality. For many younger collectors, it serves as an entry point into pre-decimal coinage, being both affordable and historically significant. In terms of symbolism, the 1967 halfpenny brings together several layers of meaning: the continuity of monarchy through Elizabeth II's effigy, the maritime and imperial past of Britain through the Golden Hind, and the economic reality of a fading denomination. It was minted at a time when Britain itself was undergoing major transitions, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, debates over European integration, and the gradual dismantling of its empire. The coin thus sits at a crossroads, embodying both tradition and change. Top 3. The 1958 halfpenny of Queen Elizabeth II belongs to the era of pre-decimal British coinage, when the complex pound-SD system, pounds, shillings, and pence, governed daily transactions. At this time, £1 sterling was divided into 20 shillings, each shilling into 12 pennies, and each penny into 2 halfpennies, meaning the halfpenny was worth 1/480th of a pound. Though it was the second lowest circulating denomination, only the farthing was smaller, but that was demonetized in 1960. It was still significant in everyday commerce. Prices for newspapers, sweets, small household items, and transport fares often required halfpennies for exact accounting. The 1958 issue sits within the early reign of Queen Elizabeth II, who had ascended the throne in 1952. By 1958, Britain was adjusting to her rule, still very much in the early years of the so-called New Elizabethan Age, marked by optimism rebuilding after World War II, and a slow shift away from the empire toward a modern welfare state. The halfpenny of this year thus reflects both continuity with centuries-old coinage and the youthful freshness of a new monarch. On the obverse, the coin bears the first official portrait of Elizabeth II, sculpted by Mary Gillick. This effigy is celebrated for its classical beauty and elegance, presenting the Queen as a young woman in her late 20s, wearing a laurel wreath with ribbons in her hair. Unlike later portraits that showed her in more formal attire or with a crown, this design was intentionally soft and naturalistic. The wreath linked Elizabeth symbolically to ancient Roman and Greek traditions of peace, victory, and civic virtue. The Latin legend around the portrait reads, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina FD, expanding to Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. This inscription, abbreviated as was traditional on coins, simultaneously proclaimed her religious authority as head of the Church of England and her secular authority as the nation's monarch. For those handling the coin in 1958, the portrait was still relatively new, having been introduced only 5 years earlier. It reminded Britons of their young queen, whose image they now encountered daily not just in newspapers and ceremonies, but in the very coins that passed through their hands. The reverse design of the 1958 halfpenny displays the famous Golden Hind, the galleon used by Sir Francis Drake on his circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580. Designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, T.H. Paget, this motif had been introduced in 1937 during the reign of George VI and was carried over into Elizabeth's coinage without change. It is one of the most iconic reverse designs of 20th-century British coins. The ship is shown in full sail, intricately detailed with masts, rigging, and billowing sails that capture a sense of adventure and movement. Above the ship is the denomination, halfpenny, while at the bottom is the date, 1958. For millions of Britons, this design was familiar and beloved, combining pride in England's maritime history with practical identification of a small bronze coin. The choice of the Golden Hind was deliberate. It celebrated Drake's heroism and England's entry into the age of exploration, but it also tied the currency of 20th-century Britain to themes of endurance, discovery, and national identity. The specifications of the 1958 halfpenny are in line with those set since the bronze coinage reform of 1860 IT was struck in bronze, primarily copper, with small amounts of tin and zinc, giving it a warm reddish-brown appearance when freshly minted, which over time would tone into darker hues with circulation and oxidation. The coin weighed 5.67 grams, measured 25.48 millimeters in diameter, and had a plain edge. By modern standards, it was quite a large coin for such a small denomination, roughly comparable in size to the later decimal 2-pence coin. This large size for little value was one reason the halfpenny would eventually be abolished, but in 1958 it remained an essential part of everyday transactions. The Royal Mint struck millions of these coins, ensuring wide circulation. While not rare today, their physical presence, heavy and solid despite their tiny value, reflected a Victorian sense of permanence that lingered well into Elizabeth's reign. In terms of historical context, the year 1958 was a period of gradual change in Britain. Politically, Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, and his government presided over a time of economic growth often called the post-war boom. Consumer goods were becoming more widely available, standards of living were improving, and the welfare state introduced after World War II was expanding. The halfpenny, though small, was still important for precise pricing in this consumer economy. Newspaper could be bought for just a few pennies, and children often clutched a handful of halfpennies to buy sweets or toys. Culturally, Britain in 1958 was on the verge of the social revolutions of the 1960s, but still grounded in older traditions, just as its coinage was still in the centuries-old pound-SD system. To hold a halfpenny in 1958 was to feel continuity stretching back through generations, even as the world outside was changing. Symbolically, the Golden Hind reverse had great resonance. Sir Francis Drake, though a controversial figure in his own time for privateering and slave-trading activities, was remembered by most Britons as a national hero. His voyage around the globe symbolized courage, exploration, and England's rise as a naval power. By placing this ship on the humble halfpenny, the state ensured that even the smallest coin carried with it a patriotic reminder of the nation's past. It was a way of connecting ordinary daily transactions to the grandeur of history. Schoolchildren often first encountered the Golden Hind not in books, but in the palm of their hand as a coin, making it an everyday educational tool as well as currency. From a numismatic perspective, the 1958 halfpenny is not a rare coin, as millions were produced and circulated. However, its value to collectors depends heavily on condition. Circulated examples are plentiful and usually worth little more than their historical interest, but uncirculated specimens, with their original mint luster intact, are more sought after, particularly in complete date runs of Elizabeth II halfpennies. Proof sets from the period, struck in limited numbers for collectors, also carry greater value. For many collectors, the 1958 issue is appealing because it represents the middle period of Elizabeth's pre-decimal coinage, still early in her reign and firmly within the Gillick portrait era. Collectors who build typesets of British coinage also appreciate it for its iconic golden hind design. The economic role of the halfpenny by 1958 was still practical, but signs of its redundancy were emerging. Inflation was slowly reducing its purchasing power, and some critics questioned whether the coin should remain in circulation. Yet for shopkeepers and consumers, it was still useful for exact pricing. A price of 2 shillings and 6.5 pence, for example, required a halfpenny for accuracy. Its continued minting through the 1950s reflected both tradition and pragmatism. The coin was not yet obsolete, though its time was running short. Within just a decade, the denomination would disappear, first with the end of the farthing in 1960, then with the halfpenny itself being withdrawn after the 1967 issue in preparation for decimalization. Top 8, the 1960 halfpenny coin of Queen Elizabeth II is a fascinating piece of British numismatic history, not because of rarity or high monetary value, but because it sits at an important crossroads in the evolution of British money. This coin, struck in bronze, belonged to the old pre-decimal system of currency, where £1 was divided into 20 shillings, each shilling into 12 pennies, and each penny into 2 halfpennies. That meant the halfpenny represented 1/480th of a pound, a tiny unit of value, but still useful in everyday commerce during the mid-20th century. By 1960, however, the halfpenny's days were numbered. Inflation and changing economic habits were eroding its purchasing power, and indeed, 1960 was the very year when its smaller cousin, the farthing, worth 1/4 of a penny, was demonetized after centuries of circulation. The 1960 halfpenny, therefore, became the smallest denomination still in use, taking on the role of the farthing in providing fractional value. To the public, this coin was familiar and practical, but in hindsight, it was one of the final steps toward the great reform of decimalization, which would arrive in 1971. The obverse design of the 1960 halfpenny features the first portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by sculptor Mary Gillick. This was the youthful effigy of the Queen, used on all circulating British coins from 1953 until the late 1960s. Gillick's portrait was intentionally idealized, showing Elizabeth as a serene young woman crowned with a laurel wreath, her hair tied with ribbons. Unlike later portraits that depicted her with a crown or more mature features, this effigy symbolized optimism and renewal at the start of her reign. Around the portrait is the Latin legend, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. laughing face, meaning Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. This inscription reinforced both her spiritual authority as head of the Church of England and her constitutional role as sovereign. For the British public in 1960, this portrait was still relatively new, only 7 years into her reign, and it represented the stability of monarchy in a world undergoing profound cultural and political changes. The reverse design of the coin carried forward one of the most iconic motifs in British coinage: the golden hind, the ship used by Sir Francis Drake on his famous circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580. This design had been introduced in 1937 under King George VI, created by designer Thomas Humphrey Paget, and it remained unchanged into Elizabeth's reign. On the halfpenny, the golden hind is depicted in full sail, finely detailed with its rigging, masts, and hull. The design symbolized England's naval tradition, its history of exploration, and its legacy as a global power. Above the ship is the denomination inscription, halfpenny, while below appears the date, 1960. The reverse was instantly recognizable to every Briton, and because the halfpenny was a common coin, the golden hind became etched into the collective memory of millions. It was not just a decorative element, but a daily reminder of England's seafaring past, linking the Elizabethan age of Drake to the modern Elizabethan monarchy. Technically, the 1960 halfpenny followed the same specifications set for bronze coinage since 1860. It was struck in bronze, an alloy primarily of copper with smaller amounts of tin and zinc, giving it a warm reddish-brown tone that would darken with age, and it measured 25.48 millimeters in diameter, weighed 5.67 grams, and had a plain edge. This size and weight, it was a relatively large coin for such a small value, especially when compared to later decimal coins. In fact, The pre-decimal halfpenny was roughly the same size as the modern decimal 2 pence coin, even though its buying power was extremely low by 1960. This mismatch between physical bulk and economic worth contributed to debates about whether small coins should remain in circulation. The historical significance of the 1960 halfpenny is closely tied to the withdrawal of the farthing in the same year. For centuries, the farthing, worth a quarter of a penny, had been the smallest circulating coin in Britain, but by 1960, inflation had made it virtually useless, and the government declared it no longer legal tender. This left the halfpenny as the absolute minimum unit of money in the country. It was still in circulation and still needed, particularly for exact pricing in the pound-SD system, but the loss of the farthing foreshadowed the eventual disappearance of the halfpenny as well. Indeed, within less than a decade, the halfpenny itself would be discontinued, with 1967 being the final year of issue for circulation. The 1960 coin, therefore, represents the moment when the halfpenny became the lowest coin in Britain, an important marker in the simplification and eventual replacement of the currency system. From an economic perspective, the halfpenny in 1960 was beginning to lose relevance but had not yet become redundant. Prices for everyday items like newspapers, bus fares, and sweets often required halfpennies for accuracy. A newspaper might cost 2 or a child's bag of sweets 1 so the halfpenny played a practical role. Shopkeepers and households still used it frequently, and millions were struck by the Royal Mint to meet demand. However, inflation was slowly eroding its usefulness, and the government began considering decimalization more seriously by the 1960s. Thus, the halfpenny in 1960 sat in an uneasy middle ground, still functional but increasingly viewed as an outdated and inefficient unit of account. Culturally, the coin carried powerful symbolism. The golden hind design celebrated Sir Francis Drake, an Elizabethan hero whose exploits resonated deeply with Britain's sense of identity as a maritime nation. For schoolchildren and ordinary citizens, the ship on the halfpenny was often their first introduction to Drake's story. It reminded people of the daring voyages, naval victories, and spirit of exploration that had defined England's role in history. Coupled with the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the coin drew an implicit connection between the Elizabethan golden age of the 16th century and the modern Elizabethan age of the 20th. This cultural symbolism gave even the smallest coin a sense of grandeur and continuity, embedding history in the fabric of everyday life. From a numismatic standpoint, the 1960 halfpenny is a relatively common coin, as millions were struck and circulated widely. Circulated examples are still easily found today and hold only modest collector value. However, uncirculated specimens with full mint luster or proof issues from special sets are more desirable. Collectors often seek to complete full-date runs of Elizabeth II halfpennies, and the 1960 coin is an essential part of such a set. Its historical connection to the demonetization of the farthing also makes it interesting, even if not rare. For younger collectors, the 1960 issue is often an entry point into pre-decimal coinage, being affordable but historically rich. In conclusion, the 1960 halfpenny of Queen Elizabeth II is a coin that embodies both tradition and transition. It continued the use of Mary Gillick's youthful portrait of the Queen and Humphrey Paget's famous golden hind reverse, tying together monarchy, maritime history, and national pride. It was still used in daily life, buying sweets, fares, and newspapers, but it was also a sign of changing times. Top 5. The 1965 halfpenny coin of Queen Elizabeth II is one of the final issues of this small bronze denomination in Britain belonging to the old pre-decimal currency system that was in use until 1971. The halfpenny, worth 1/2 penny, or 1/480th of a pound, had been in circulation in one form or another since the 13th century, but by the mid-20th century it was rapidly losing practical use. The 1965 issue, therefore, stands as both a continuation of a long monetary tradition and a symbol of an era of transition, when Britain was slowly preparing for the decimalization of its currency. By 1965, the halfpenny was already seen as a low-value coin, but it still had a place in everyday life, particularly for small purchases such as newspapers, bus fares, and children's sweets. To the ordinary person, the coin was familiar and unremarkable. To historians and collectors today, it represents a moment in time, when old currency traditions met the economic and cultural realities of a changing Britain. On the obverse side, the coin bears the famous first portrait of Queen Elizabeth II designed by the sculptor Mary Gillick. This effigy was used on all British circulating coins from 1953 until 1967, and it shows the Queen in a fresh, youthful style, without a crown, but with a simple laurel wreath tied with a ribbon. The choice of the laurel wreath was symbolic as it evoked the classical imagery of victory and peace, while also emphasizing her role as a young and modern monarch at the dawn of her reign. The portrait of Elizabeth II by Gillick was the last British coinage portrait to appear without a crown or diadem. Later effigies of the Queen, created by Arnold Machin, Raphael Maclauf, and others depicted her with more regal and formal attributes. Around the Queen's portrait runs the Latin inscription, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. Laughing Face : which translates to, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen Defender of the Faith. This inscription encapsulated her constitutional role as head of state and her religious authority as supreme governor of the Church of England for people of the time. This was a familiar wording, but to modern collectors, it is a window into the ceremonial and traditional language that still framed British coinage. The reverse design of the 1965 halfpenny carried the enduring motif of the Golden Hind, the ship of Sir Francis Drake, who was one of Elizabeth I's most famous sea captains. Drake's Golden Hind became a national legend after his voyage around the globe between 1577 and 1580, and the choice of this ship for the reverse of the halfpenny connected the modern Elizabethan age with the first Elizabethan era of exploration, naval power, and empire. Designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, the Golden Hind design had first been introduced in 1937 for King George VI and carried over unchanged to Elizabeth II's reign. On the coin, the ship is shown in full sail, detailed with rigging and multiple masts, with the denomination halfpenny above and the date 1965 below. For millions of Britons, this design was instantly recognizable, as the halfpenny circulated widely. Children especially remember this design fondly, as halfpennies were often the coins given as pocket money or spent at sweet shops. The Golden Hind became so associated with the coin that, even long after its withdrawal, people recalled it as the ship coin. From a technical standpoint, the 1965 halfpenny retained the specifications that had been standard for bronze coinage since Victorian times. It was struck in bronze, an alloy of 95% copper, 4% tin, and 1% zinc, giving it a reddish tone when new, which would darken to brown as it circulated. The coin measured 25.48 millimeters in diameter, weighed 5.67 grams, and had a plain edge. At this size and weight, it was actually quite a large coin for such a small unit of value compared to modern decimal coins. The pre-decimal halfpenny was roughly the size of a 2-pence piece, despite being worth less than 1/200th of a pound in today's terms. Its relative bulk versus its tiny value was one of the criticisms that would later fuel arguments for simplifying the coinage system. Nevertheless, in 1965, the halfpenny was still being produced in very large quantities by the Royal Mint, ensuring that it remained plentiful in circulation. The historical context of Britain in 1965 adds depth to the story of this coin. The mid-1960s were a period of significant social, cultural, and political change. Britain was in the midst of decolonization, withdrawing from its former empire and redefining its place in the world. Domestically, this was the age of modernization, consumer growth, and the Cultural Revolution symbolized by the rise of the Beatles and the swinging 60s. In monetary terms, however, Britain was still using the centuries-old pound-SD system. Pounds, shillings, and pence, which was increasingly seen as outdated and confusing, especially in comparison to the decimal systems used by other nations. Discussions about decimalization were intensifying in the 1960s, and by 1966, the government would announce plans to move to a decimal system. The 1965 halfpenny, therefore, represents the last years of the old order. It is a relic of a system soon to be swept away, yet at the time it was an ordinary part of daily life. From an economic perspective, the 1965 halfpenny was losing much of its purchasing power, but it was still useful for specific transactions. A newspaper might cost 2.5d, or a bus fare might include a halfpenny in its price, making the coin essential for exact change. However, inflation was eroding its utility, and more people regarded it as a nuisance rather than a convenience. This sentiment would only grow stronger in the following years, leading to the eventual discontinuation of the coin. The last circulation halfpennies were struck in 1967, after which they were quietly withdrawn ahead of decimalization in 1971. In this sense, the 1965 issue belongs to the final chapter of the halfpenny's long history, marking its decline from once useful unit to redundant small change. Top 6. The 1955 halfpenny of Queen Elizabeth II belongs to the era of pre-decimal British currency, where £1 was divided into 20 shillings, each shilling into 12 pennies, and each penny into 2 halfpennies. His meant the halfpenny, at a value of 1/480 of a pound, was one of the smallest monetary units in the system. Despite its tiny value, the halfpenny had a long history dating back centuries, and it played a practical role in the economy of daily life. In 1955, Britain was still rebuilding from the effects of World War II, rationing had only just ended the year before, and money was tight for many households. Even small value coins like the halfpenny mattered for transactions involving bus fares, newspapers, and food. However, the specific 1955 halfpenny was not meant for circulation. It was instead produced as part of special proof coin sets issued by the Royal Mint to mark the beginning of Queen Elizabeth II's coinage. On the obverse side, the coin features the very first effigy of Queen Elizabeth II, designed by the sculptor Mary Gillick. This portrait is famous as the most youthful and idealistic representation of the Queen ever used on British coinage. T shows her without a crown, wearing only a laurel wreath tied with a ribbon, with her hair flowing back naturally. The laurel wreath is a classical symbol, evoking victory, peace, and continuity with ancient traditions. Gillick's design was chosen to represent the optimism of a new reign following the death of King George VI, and it reflected Elizabeth's youth. She was only 27 when the portrait was approved. Surrounding the portrait is the Latin inscription Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. Laughing Face, which translates to Elizabeth II by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. This legend connected her to both religious authority and constitutional sovereignty, embedding tradition into the very fabric of the coin. For numismatists, the 1955 issue represents the very first appearance of this now classic portrait on a halfpenny, making it historically significant. The reverse design carried over from earlier reigns, featuring the famous Golden Hind, the ship of Sir Francis Drake. This design had first been introduced in 1937 during the reign of George VI, created by the artist Thomas Humphrey Paget, and it was retained for Elizabeth's early halfpennies as well. The Golden Hind was the vessel in which Drake completed his circumnavigation of the globe in 1577 to 1581, of the great feats of the Elizabethan age. By placing this ship on the halfpenny, the Royal Mint drew a deliberate symbolic link between the first Elizabethan era of exploration and empire and the new Elizabethan era beginning in the mid-20th century. On the 1955 coin, the ship is shown in fine detail, with its sails billowing and its rigging clearly depicted. The words "halfpenny" appear above, and the date 1955 is inscribed below. For ordinary Britons, this design would become very familiar in circulation coins from later years, but the 1955 proof halfpenny was the first time it appeared alongside Elizabeth II's effigy. In terms of technical specifications, the coin adhered to the long-established standards for bronze coinage. T was struck in bronze, an alloy of copper, about 97%, tin, and zinc, which gave the coin a reddish-brown appearance when new. Over time, circulation pieces would darken with use, but the 1955 issue, being struck only in proof quality, retained its bright, polished finish. The coin had a diameter of 25.48 millimeters, a weight of 5.67 grams, and a plain edge. These specifications had been in place since the Victorian era, and they created a coin that was relatively large in physical size compared to its tiny value. For comparison, the pre-decimal halfpenny was almost the same size as the modern decimal 2p coin, but worth far, far less in purchasing power. The unique historical context of 1955 gives this coin special importance. Queen Elizabeth II had ascended to the throne in 1952 after the death of her father, King George VI, but the transition to her coinage was gradual. Coins bearing her portrait did not appear in circulation until 1953. By 1955, the Royal Mint was still issuing coins of George VI in circulation, and no Elizabeth II halfpennies were actually struck for everyday use that year. Instead, the 1955 dated halfpennies were only included in official proof sets produced for collectors and for ceremonial purposes. This means that no one in 1955 would have handled a halfpenny of Elizabeth II in their change. They existed only in pristine, specially made sets. This fact makes the 1955 halfpenny rare in comparison to later years, though not necessarily valuable, as many proof sets were carefully preserved by collectors. The economic significance of the coin is tied to the post-war period in Britain. Although inflation was slowly eroding the value of the halfpenny, it still played a role in pricing and commerce. In the mid-1950s, items such as bus tickets, newspapers, and groceries often had halfpenny values, and the coin remained a necessary part of the currency system. The fact that the farthing, worth 1/4 of a penny, was still circulating until 1960 shows just how important small denominations were at the time. However, the exclusion of the halfpenny from general mintage in 1955 also highlights the transition and adjustment period that marked Elizabeth's early reign. From a cultural perspective, the 1955 halfpenny links together the two Elizabethan eras, the ship of Sir Francis Drake on one side, and the young Elizabeth II on the other. This was no accident. The Royal Mint and the government understood the symbolic power of coins. By carrying over the Golden Hind design, they reminded the public of England's glorious naval past, while the Queen's portrait signaled a hopeful new age. Together, the designs created a narrative of continuity, resilience, and tradition, all encapsulated in a tiny bronze disc. For collectors, the 1955 halfpenny is especially significant because it was only issued in proof sets and not for general use. As a result, it is scarcer than most other Elizabethan halfpennies, though it is not prohibitively rare. Many examples survive in excellent condition because proof sets were cherished and preserved. Today the coin is valued more for its historical context than for intrinsic rarity. Numismatists prize it as the first year of issue for Elizabeth II halfpennies and as part of the complete proof set of 1955, which also included other denominations. A single 1955 proof halfpenny in pristine condition can be worth several pounds, while a full proof set commands significantly more. Top 7. The 1957 halfpenny of Queen Elizabeth II was one of the small bronze coins circulating widely in mid-20th century Britain in the old pound-SD system, pounds, shillings, pence. The halfpenny was worth 1/2 of a penny or 1/480th of a pound. Despite this minuscule value, the halfpenny still had an important role in everyday life in the 1950s. Prices were often given in fractions of a penny. For example, bus fares, newspaper sweets, or groceries might be priced at 1/1/2D to 1/2D, or 5/1/2D, which made the halfpenny essential for exact change. By 1957, the coin had already been circulating under Queen Elizabeth II for several years, but it was still considered a relatively new coinage because the monarch had only acceded to the throne in 1952. While the farthing was still in circulation until 1960, the halfpenny was already assuming its role as the lowest practical denomination. On the obverse side, the 1957 halfpenny bears the youthful portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by Mary Gillick. This portrait, first introduced in 1953, was used throughout the early part of her reign and is famous for its simplicity and elegance. Unlike later effigies that depicted the queen wearing a crown or tiara, Gillick's design showed her uncrowned, adorned only with a laurel wreath tied with ribbons. The laurel wreath itself was an important classical symbol, representing peace, victory, and civic honor. Gillick's decision to portray Elizabeth in this way reflected the optimism of her early reign and avoided excessive regal formality. Around the portrait runs the Latin inscription, Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F. Laughing Face, meaning, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God Queen, defender of the faith. This inscription confirmed both her divine right to rule and her role as supreme governor of the Church of England, linking the monarchy to centuries of constitutional and religious tradition. For Britons of 1957, this portrait was already familiar, but to modern collectors it stands as a symbol of post-war renewal and youthful monarchy. The reverse design features the famous Golden Hind, the galleon used by Sir Francis Drake during his circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580, designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget. This motif had first appeared on the halfpenny in 1937 under King George VI and continued unchanged into Elizabeth II's reign. The Golden Hind was chosen as a symbol of England's seafaring heritage, Elizabethan exploration, and naval power. On the coin, the ship is shown in full sail, detailed with masts, rigging, and hull, giving a strong sense of movement and adventure. The inscription, halfpenny, is placed above the ship, with the date 1957 below. The design connected Elizabeth II's reign with that of her great namesake Elizabeth I, whose era had been marked by England's rise as a maritime power. For ordinary people in 1957, the image of the Golden Hind was less about historical accuracy and more about tradition. It was a familiar and trusted design, symbolizing continuity. The technical specifications of the 1957 halfpenny followed the long-standing standards of bronze coinage. It was struck in bronze, composed of copper, about 97%, tin and zinc, giving the coin a reddish tone when new. With circulation, coins would darken and develop a brown patina, often with wear around the edges. The coin weighed 5.67 grams, measured 25.48 millimeters in diameter, and had a plain edge. In size, the pre-decimal halfpenny was surprisingly large for such a low denomination, roughly equivalent to today's decimal 2-pence piece. This mismatch between physical bulk and tiny value eventually made the coin seem impractical, but in 1957 it was still widely accepted and needed. The historical context of Britain in 1957 adds another layer to the coin story. This was a post-war society that was modernizing rapidly. Britain was still adjusting to its reduced role on the world stage, as decolonization was underway and new social and cultural shifts were beginning to emerge. At home, economic recovery was advancing, and ordinary people were beginning to enjoy improved living standards, yet inflation was gradually undermining the usefulness of the smallest coins, and debates about the future of the pound-SD system were quietly starting. Decimalization would not be officially decided until the mid-1960s, but already the need for reform was evident. The halfpenny of 1957, therefore, represents a monetary unit that was both traditional and increasingly fragile in a changing economy. Economically, the halfpenny coin of 1957 still served an important role. Even though it was a very low denomination, items such as sweets, small groceries, or fares could involve halfpennies in their prices. For example, a bar of chocolate might cost 2.5d, making the halfpenny essential. Its circulation numbers were very high. As the Royal Mint continued to produce large quantities to keep pace with demand, however, the purchasing power of the coin was gradually declining, and within just over a decade it would disappear from circulation entirely. Culturally, the coin had meaning beyond its face value. The Golden Hind design celebrated Sir Francis Drake's voyage and connected the modern Queen Elizabeth II to Elizabeth I, reinforcing a sense of national pride in continuity and maritime tradition. For children, the halfpenny was a common coin used in small transactions, often remembered fondly as pocket money. For adults, it was part of everyday commerce, and budgeting often kept in purses or tins to make up exact amounts. Its distinctive size and ship design made it instantly recognizable, embedding it into the collective memory of generations. From a numismatic perspective, the 1957 halfpenny is not considered rare, as it was produced in very large quantities for circulation. Most examples are found today in well-worn condition, having passed through countless hands. Circulated coins are worth little more than face value to collectors. However, uncirculated coins with original mint luster are more desirable, especially in collections that aim to cover every year of Elizabeth II's early coinage. Proof versions were not struck in 1957, which makes circulation strikes the only form available. For collectors, the coin's interest lies less in rarity and more in its historical context as part of the early Elizabethan series. Top 8, the 1959 halfpenny of Queen Elizabeth II, is a small bronze coin from Britain's pre-decimal monetary system, which lasted until 1971. In this old system, £1 was divided into 20 shillings, and each shilling into 12 pence, meaning 240 pence equaled £1. The halfpenny was equal to 1/2 of 1 penny, or 1/480th of a pound, a tiny fraction of value in today's terms. Yet despite its small worth, the halfpenny was crucial for everyday life in 1959 Britain. Prices for goods and services were often written in increments involving halfpennies. A bus fare might be 1/1/2d, a newspaper might cost 2/1/2d, and sweets or groceries often relied on this denomination to make exact pricing possible. Thus, though small, the halfpenny was a practical part of daily commerce. On the obverse, the coin bears the youthful portrait of Queen Elizabeth II designed by Mary Gillick. First used in 1953, this portrait is especially important to collectors because it represents the first definitive coinage portrait of Elizabeth II. Gillick depicted the Queen uncrowned, with a laurel wreath tied with ribbon in her hair. This classical style recalled ancient Roman imagery, associating Elizabeth with peace, victory, and continuity, rather than with imperial grandeur. Around the effigy runs the Latin inscription Elizabeth II Dei Gratia Regina F laughing face : meaning Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. The inclusion of F laughing face, Fidei Defensor, tied the Queen to her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. To a 1959 citizen, this portrait symbolized optimism and modernity, presenting a youthful monarch in the early years of her reign. On the reverse side, the 1959 halfpenny displays the celebrated image of the Golden Hind, the galleon commanded by Sir Francis Drake during his circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580. Designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, this reverse had been introduced in 1937 during the reign of King George VI and was retained into Elizabeth II's reign with no changes. The Golden Hind is shown in full sail with striking details of the masts, rigging and billowing sails, projecting a sense of energy and exploration. Above the ship is the denomination inscription, halfpenny, and the date 1959 appears below. The ship was not only a reference to Elizabethan naval strength, but also a symbolic bridge between Queen Elizabeth I's age of discovery and Queen Elizabeth II's modern Britain. By 1959, the design was familiar to millions, evoking continuity with the past while functioning as a symbol of tradition and technical specifications. The coin was struck in bronze, a copper-based alloy traditionally used for low-value British coinage. The composition was roughly 97% copper with small proportions of tin and zinc. The coin weighed 5.67 grams, had a diameter of 25.48 millimeters, and a plain edge. Its relatively large size for such a low denomination often surprises modern collectors. Indeed, it was about the size of today's 2-pence coin despite being worth less than half of a modern penny in real terms. When freshly struck, the bronze coins had a bright reddish tone. but they quickly dulled to a darker brown in circulation. Many coins in use by 1959 would have shown wear and smoothing, since halfpennies changed hands frequently in everyday life. The historical background of Britain in 1959 helps explain the context of this coin. Post-war recovery had largely stabilized, and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan famously declared that Britons had never had it so good. Consumerism was rising, wages were improving, and ordinary people were gaining access to cars, televisions, and household appliances. Yet inflation was slowly eroding the purchasing power of money, including the halfpenny. By the end of the 1950s, its value was already beginning to feel small compared with growing living costs, though it still served a purpose in transactions. Decimalization was not yet decided, but discussions were ongoing in government and among economists about reforming the cumbersome pound-SD system. Thus, the 1959 halfpenny represents a transitional era. It was still vital for commerce but also increasingly seen as old-fashioned. Economically, the coin served as a low-value but functional unit. Shops priced many goods in halfpenny increments. For example, a child might buy sweets for 1/1/2 D, or a local bus fare might cost an odd number of pence plus a half. The existence of the halfpenny made it possible to avoid rounding up costs, ensuring fairness for both consumers and businesses. In practice, the coin often jingled in the pockets of children, workers, and housewives, used for the smallest day-to-day purchases. Without the halfpenny, pricing flexibility would have been lost, which is why it was still in wide use in 1959. The cultural significance of the golden hind design added depth to this coin. For schoolchildren and the public, it evoked stories of Sir Francis Drake's daring voyages during Elizabeth I's reign. The ship represented not only adventure but also England's heritage as a seafaring nation. In the 1950s, when Britain was experiencing the decline of its empire and adjusting to new global realities, coins like the halfpenny symbolized continuity and pride in national history. The golden hind thus functioned as more than a design. It was a reminder of resilience, exploration, and identity. In numismatic terms, the 1959 halfpenny is not considered rare, as it was struck in very large numbers for circulation by the Royal Mint. Millions were produced, meaning that today they are widely available in circulated grades. Most surviving examples are well worn, as the coin was heavily used in everyday life. Uncirculated examples, however, are scarcer and more desirable to collectors, especially those with full original mint luster. Proof coins were not issued in 1959, so collectors rely entirely on circulation strikes. Values remain modest, with worn pieces worth little more than a few pennies, but pristine examples can attract more interest. From a design history perspective, the 1959 halfpenny is also important because it represents the continuation of Mary Gillick's obverse and Paget's reverse. Later in Elizabeth's reign, the portrait would change several times, to designs by Mackin, Maclouf, and Clark. But in 1959, the coinage still carried the optimism of the youthful queen. Many collectors regard this period as one of the most aesthetically pleasing phases of Elizabeth II's coinage, because of Gillick's timeless, neoclassical portrait. Ordinary Britons, the 1959 halfpenny had a human meaning. Tea was a coin that children handled regularly, often remembered as pocket money. For adults, it filled purses, jars, and change drawers, helping them manage household budgets in a precise way. Its distinctive size and ship design made it easy to recognize. For many people alive in the 1950s and 1960s, the halfpenny evokes nostalgia memories of small purchases, fairground rides, or sweet shops where every coin counted. This emotional connection means that, while the coin is not financially valuable, it holds sentimental worth to those who used it. By the early 1970s, the halfpenny was withdrawn when Britain decimalized in 1971, replacing the pound-SD system with a modern decimal currency. At that point, the pre-decimal halfpenny ceased to be legal tender, and its role in the economy ended. Today, the 1959 halfpenny is a relic of a vanished currency system, a tangible reminder of how daily life was measured and managed in pre-decimal Britain. Thanks for watching my videos. Please subscribe my channel for more videos.